is the start of the so-called Arab Spring, which swept across North Africa and the Middle East. In Tunisia, often hailed as having one of the most peaceful transitions at the time, protests have erupted again. What are we to make of this new wave of violence? And in Germany, Angela Merkel's party has come to an agreement with the SPD's leadership, but is a new grand coalition likely at this late stage? Welcome to The Point. Live from Beijing, I'm Li Xin. Tunisians on Sunday marked 7 years since the uprising that launched the so-called Arab Spring. The North African country had been seen as having had a relatively smooth democratic transition since January the 14th, 2011. That was when President Ben Ali was toppled after 23 years in power. But anger has risen again over austerity measures introduced after a year of rising prices, with protesters chanting the 2011 slogans of work, freedom, dignity. So what has sparked this new wave of Tunisian violence? Where are we after 7 years, after the 7th anniversary, shall I say, of those uprisings, and is the Middle East now in an even worse situation from what it was? With me for the discussion are Maria Makahleh, president of the Moscow-based International Middle Eastern Studies Club, and Sarah Feuer, a fellow of the program on Arab politics at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, joining us from Tel Aviv. Welcome to the show, ladies. Ms. Makahleh, Tunisia had been praised by Western media for its steps towards democracy in the years since the so-called Arab Spring. However, 7 years on, we're seeing this new waves of violence. Exactly what went wrong?
The issue is that, somehow Tunisia was the most successful example of the, let's say, Arab Spring revolution. It was quite smoothly and it was moving, let's say, more successful than in other countries. But the issue is that we have been witnessing during this year the emergence of civil society, that was that people felt their own responsibility for their own future, and especially among the youth. But speaking of the government, it really has failed to meet the expectations of the Tunisian people, and we have to acknowledge this, because the level of unemployment in Tunisia is 35%, and it's very high in the majority of the youth. Until now, youth find themselves totally useless inside their own country, and they face lots of problems in terms of finding the jobs opportunities and realizing their own potential. And until now, most of the problems that Tunisia has been facing before, were not tackled by the current government, and also the austerity measures they had to impose following the International Monetary Fund requests, and this because of those loans also made the situation is even much more difficult. And the uprising that we are facing now in Tunisia, these manifestations marking also anniversary of the revolution, but as well the jump of the taxes and the rise of the prices, it is exactly the result we have come to. Nothing has changed in terms of improvement of political, economical life in Tunisia, and it's a big problem.
Okay, Ms. Feuer, your take on the situation. As we've heard, youth unemployment in the country now stands at over 1/3. Why have things not improved over the years? Can the government be blamed, or is it down simply to economic forces over which the government has little control?
Well, I would echo some of what your other guests said. I would maybe tweak the interpretation a little bit, just by noting that actually on the political front, there has been tremendous progress in the last 7 years. And in fact, I think that what we're seeing now is in a strange way a result of the fact that for those first 7 years, the country was busy focusing on political reforms, getting its security situation under control. I mean, we have to remember Tunisia suffered a series of terrorist attacks, an insurgency attempt in 2016. And so to some extent, I think the governments were preoccupied with trying to get the security situation under control and also to lay the foundation of a political system that could replace what had been essentially a police state under a dictatorship. Now, it's true that in being preoccupied with those two massive sets of problems, the governments did not have the political will or inclination, or in some cases the bandwidth, to deal with very serious economic problems. And so the proximate cause of these latest protests, which I would not characterize yet as an uprising, I mean, this is still early, but the proximate cause of these protests were these price increases that resulted from the agreement that Tunisia made with the International Monetary Fund last year in exchange for nearly $3 billion in loans, which the country very, very badly needed. The government agreed to rein in spending, reduce wage increases. And so some of the price hikes that we're seeing now are a painful result of this agreement that was made.
Well, you mentioned this agreement between the government of Tunisia and the International Monetary Fund. Ms. Makahleh, how do you look at the demands from the International Monetary Fund? Some people are saying these demands are too harsh for the government to bear at this moment, and they have blamed the IMF for what is happening at this moment. What is your take on this question?
Before answering your question, I would love to return back to the point why I was saying about the, let's say, political fair. I mean, the main demands of the revolution of 2011 were, as we were already saying, it's work, freedom, and dignity. And neither work nor freedom nor dignity were not met by the government. Concentrated on political reforms, okay, stabilization of political system, okay, security, yes. But the most important for the society of Tunisia were economical issues. They were chasing for opportunities, for work, for jobs, and so like that through for the life full of dignity. And until now, we see what's happening in Tunisia, and that people didn't meet their expectations, and the government didn't, have failed to prove its capabilities of improving the situation, economical situation they have.
Let me ask you this question, Ms. Makahleh. Let me ask you this question. Do you think it's a matter of this particular government? By the way, we've had 9 different governments over the past 7 years. Do you think it's the failure of any particular government, or is the system that is to blame for the lack of progress that Tunisia is suffering from?
It's a difficult question because the problems in Tunisia didn't start yesterday. It was these problems were during the Ben Ali rule and even before, and none of the governments were successful in tackling these issues. It's, I think it can be mostly a multi-level problem, but I think that European countries could try to make assistance, even in terms of advisory. And there are a lot of advisors from European countries, but still there is a gap between the understanding what's really happening and what can be done. There is no breakthrough until now in this track, and that's what is needed, because we are trying to start with political system, rearranging it with struggling for democracy. Yes, it's important, but sometimes you need to consolidate the power more, maybe in sometimes limiting the freedoms or whatever, but improving and posing more attention on the economical issues. Because until now, with strong consolidation of the society, little can be done in this sense. Yeah. But regarding the IMF, yes, the demands are always very tough, and requirements. For Tunisia, these demands are really very hard to bear. especially taking the current situation, but they had no options in the current situation. Really.
Sure. Ms. Feuer, you
like
were talking.
The dead end.
Yeah, Ms. Feuer, you were talking about the Tunisian government having to focus on the security, on the political picture first before they can focus on the economy. However, it's been 7 years. If a government cannot recover 7 years after the uprising, what good, or a system, what good is it to bring to have this new system? What are you seeing? Are you saying that in the near future, once the political situation is better, people will be happier, the economy will be better automatically?
Well, first of all, what I said earlier, I don't mean to suggest that the governments that have come since 2011 were right or wrong to be not equipped or not turning their attention to the economy. All I was trying to point out is that there was a very long list of issues for Tunisia to deal with, and I completely agree with Maria that the demands of the initial uprising were mostly economic in nature. I do think that there was this idea, and I think there still is this idea, that if you have the option between a democratic government or an authoritarian kind of dictatorship, people are more likely to still want a democratic political system, in part, and no small part, because the calculation is that they are more likely to have their demands met. So I think what we're seeing in Tunisia is a bit of a mismatch now, and it's something that has grown in the last few years, where you have essentially the beginnings of a democratic political system, and the economy has not caught up. Now, what can be done today? I mean, it is interesting to see that even in response to these protests that broke out, I mean, we are not in the pre-2011 days of Tunisia. You already have the government coming out trying to indicate that it will try to adopt some measures, giving greater assistance to families living in poverty, to try and mitigate
temporary
the
measures. You think fundamentally in the long term?
Reforms.
Yeah, you think in the long term, by giving these, tips, sweet candies, the problem can be solved? I'm really running out of the time. 30 seconds, please, for Ms. Feuer.
No, I think that there will have to be some serious fundamental structural changes to the Tunisian economy, and what we may be seeing now is the beginnings of an attempt to move in that direction. But there's no question it's going to be painful, and the government needs to work with its allies in Europe and the United States to try and help cushion the blow of some of these measures that it's going to have to take.
Okay, unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to our two guests, Maria Makahleh, President of the Moscow-based International Middle Eastern Studies Club, and Sarah Feuer, a fellow of the program on Arab politics at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And here is my opinion, my first point. Ever since the so-called Arab Spring in 2011, Tunisia has been in economic crisis. The 9 governments that have been in power have yet to bring the country back on the right track. In a way, the problem Tunisia is faced with is not uncommon, and it all boils down to one dilemma, in my eyes: political rights versus development rights. Whether or not it's a Western-style liberal democracy to deliver development through good governance, and the ability to do that quickly are crucial for developing countries. When the wind of revolution swept across the Middle East and North Africa 7 years ago, what the West has provided has been the promise of greater political rights, but without the necessary tool to promote socio-economic development, greater political rights could end up becoming a political game, one elected government replacing another like a merry-go-round, but nothing really changes on the ground. You're watching The Point. I'll be back right after this. An agreement that paves the way for Angela Merkel to form a new coalition government in Germany has been cast in doubt by a growing rebellion in the Social Democrat Party, or SPD. Merkel and the SPD leader Martin Schulz sealed a deal to open formal coalition negotiations last Friday, but the agreement has to be approved by a special SPD Party Congress next Sunday. Already there are signs of growing discontent within that party. The deal has lost its first vote after the SPD Regional Association in Saxony-Anhalt voted to oppose joining a coalition last Saturday. How likely is a renewed version of the grand coalition of the past 4 years between Merkel's party and the SPD? If the SPD votes no, Merkel faces the prospect of new elections or trying to form a minority government. What is likely to happen, and how has Germany's economy and by extension the EU as a whole been affected by Germany's political paralysis? Joining me for today's discussion from Tallinn, Estonia, Dr. Florian Hartleb, a German political scientist and research associate at the Brussels-based think tank Wilfried Martens Centre for European Studies, and Dr. Josef Braml, expert on transatlantic relations and German political systems, also editor-in-chief of the German Council on Foreign Relations Yearbook from Berlin. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Dr. Hartleb, the main policy points the CDU and the SPD have been negotiating are strengthening and reforming the Eurozone, including paying more into the EU budget, capping refugee intake per year, and not increasing taxes, together with a rise in government spending on education and construction. Which are the most contentious policy differences that still divide the two parties?
It's migration, stupid. The migration was the central topic for these elections, which basically caused a decline of both parties, and there is still the huge challenge to integrate the refugees and the migrants in the German labor market, and many people are afraid. So basically the result of the election was that the first time in the German history since 1945 a right-wing populist party is part of the government, and this causing a lot of problems. So there are only 3 options left, as pointed out. First of all, this grand coalition. Basically the Social Democrats said they don't want to have it directly after the elections. Secondly, would be a minority government, which is very unpopular in the German political culture, at least on the national level. And the third option is the new election, which nobody likes because of the potential growth of the right-wing populists.
Right. Dr. Braml, now the SPD were junior partners with Merkel's Conservatives from 2013 to 2017. Besides policy differences, some SPD members were also unwilling to enter into another coalition, thinking the CDU, CSU took too much credit for some work made by the SPD. So what's at stake for the SPD on Sunday?
Well, from their point of view, they don't have good options. They don't want to prolong the Grand Coalition with Angela Merkel because obviously some people in the SPD are afraid of her. But on the other hand, they have an even more scary scenario, re-elections, and I think they would lose even more. So at the end of the day, they will have to come to terms and govern with Merkel. Maybe this time they learn from their previous mistakes and claim more credit for their own policies.
Dr. Hartleb, last Saturday, as I said, the SPD Regional Association in Saxony-Anhalt voted to oppose joining a coalition. This is bad news for Martin Schulz for the Sunday's Party Congress. How much influence do you think the Saxony vote will have on the vote on Sunday? Do they have a choice?
They don't have really a choice. The pressure is very much. Schulz until now failed in his leadership. It was a big strategic mistake Schulz made directly after the election when he declared clearly he wants to go in the opposition. The SPD needs to regenerate itself, and now he has to advertise for a new course without many big options for the Social Democrats. Also the youth branch is very critical towards this part of the government, being a government, and I think these tensions will continue, but the Grand Coalition will come because of the lack of alternatives after the so-called Jamaica negotiations has failed, and Germany now is already as long as never before without an elected government. More than 100 days already, and it will continue at least until Easter. So the pressure is quite much, and there won't be a big euphoria in the next parliamentary assemblies and also in all this governmental process and in the concrete coalition negotiations. But the party congress will decide, not with a big majority, but they will decide at the end of the day to be part of the government.
Dr. Braml, as mentioned earlier, Martin Schulz initially didn't want to enter into a coalition, but after the failure of the so-called Jamaica coalition talks, he changed his mind. Could you elaborate, explain to us a little bit what was his rationale, why did he have to change his mind, and also because of this kind of perceived failure, strategic failure on Schulz, how much more difficulty is it for him to persuade the majority of the party to follow him and to continue in the leadership position of the SPD in the future?
Well, it's difficult for a party to follow its leader when on one day he says, let's go in this direction, and a few days later, actually a few weeks later, he tells them to go in the opposite direction. I think it will be difficult for him to remain his leadership. I think it has been much of it all about his own political future career. He tried to save his leadership by getting into the opposition, and now he's trying to save it by being part of the government. But the SPD has a long history of getting rid of party leaders. He may be one of them.
Dr. Hartleb, what is your take on that situation, on the political future of Martin Schulz?
Martin Schulz started after his career on the European level. He was the president of the European Parliament even, with big hopes. He lost the election. He couldn't perform in his leadership. He made this big strategic mistake, totally excluding the option being a part of the government, which is not fitting for a party like the Social Democrats, which always took over responsibility in the long history of the party. So I think Schulz has not a very big future. I think still he will be a part of the government. He will continue as a party leader, but the opposition will try to form an alternative, and at the end of the day the Social Democrats, they will be weaker and weaker. I don't see a big future at the moment for them, because also Merkel and the CDU and also the CSU in Bavaria, which is also facing elections, they are all under the pressure of the new right-wing populist party, this AfD, and this is also clearly written in the negotiation paper, which is already released, that many people in Germany are afraid. And this is a kind of a paradox, because on the one hand the German economy is booming, but on the other hand there are people who are alienated from the political system, believing in fake news because of the refugees. So it's a cultural issue at the moment.
Yes, Dr. Braml, my last question, really try to be short if you can. What is this going to do for the country of Germany in the context of EU, and for the leadership of Merkel in the context of the EU, when France is, coming to China representing Europe, saying the Europe is back, when France is trying to push for Eurozone reform? What is all that paralysis and the uncertainty so far say about the future in those two fronts?
Well, that's actually the way forward. Macron, the French president, is waiting. He laid out big plans, so Merkel now has to catch up. And now with the Social Democrats, you have a more pro-European party than the libertarian FDP would have been. So Germany is more willing to join France and to play a bigger role on the international scene. It's not only China getting into Europe's backyard, it's also the United States of America that has been pushing us to think on our own feet.
And Dr. Hartleb, your take on the same question?
I think Merkel lost also, not only Schulz, but also Merkel lost her power in the sense that it will be very hard for her to continue with the refugee policy, and as well on the European level it will be very hard because the Social Democrats, they clearly want to have, as Schulz said, the United States of Europe, and the model of the Christian Democratic Union is a different one. So at the end of the day, Merkel, Germany will lose on the European level. Macron will push his ideas forward, and he will search for new alliance, such as the young Austrian leader Sebastian Kurz, for example, or even Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, who is very critical in the refugee question now, will go forward in the sense to have a stricter migration policy also on the European level, and not to figure out the European solution with the distribution of a refugee, what both Merkel and Schulz want.
We'll keep a close watch on the situation. Many thanks to the two guests here, Dr. Florian Hartleb, German political scientist and research associate at the Brussels-based think tank Wilfried Martens Centre for European Studies, and Dr. Josef Braml, expert on transatlantic relations and German political systems, also editor-in-chief of the German Council on Foreign Relations Yearbook. And that is it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. Follow me on Facebook or Twitter using the handle The Point with Alex. Download the application called CGTN to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. We've got The Point.